Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video with Mr. Terry as I continue my search for historical knowledge here on the internet. Alright, I'm a simple man. I see a new Oversimplified video, I watch the new Oversimplified video, and it looks like they just released the American Civil War. So, what more needs to be said about Oversimplified? They're easily one of my favorite history channels on the internet. Everything they put out has been good, and I think they're getting better as they've gone on. They're getting funnier, they're more detailed, great information. They just keep getting better. So this is a no-brainer, right? All right, looks like they did two parts on this, and they released them basically back to back. So we're gonna be watching part one today. Look out for part two in the near future. Now, unless you're crazy, you probably are sub to Oversimplified, but if you are not, go down below into my description here and click on the link. That'll take you to the original video. Whether you're sub to them or not, be sure to like the video if you like it, sub to them again if you haven't, and give them credit for the awesome work that they do. And if you haven't subbed to my channel, love to have you around our community, so hit that sub button, enable notifications, especially if you'd like to be a part of live premieres and live streams that I do, so you can know when those happen. All right, let's go ahead and get started. The American Civil War, Part 1.
This video was made possible by NordVPN. Click the link down below to get 70% off an annual subscription, plus an additional month free.
Yay.
Also, stun your friends, turn heads, get compliments. Buy yourself some Oversimplified merch today, along with a very own
little stick figure
character pin. Link in the description
I'd like
down
that.
below. Okay, Mrs. Lincoln, this is it. One last push, and we're done. 9 months and 4 days ago, my father brought forth upon my mother himself and gave to her a child, conceived in a shack in Kentucky and dedicated to the proposition that I will drink num-nums from a bottle and do little poo-poos in my pantses for the next 2 to 3 years. Now what is it babies do again?
True story.
Oh yeah.
Oh man, great intro. I feel like these guys are getting funnier too as time goes on. So the moral here, I guess, is, you know, Abraham Lincoln's going to be crying. Is that what the Civil War essentially was his crying for not having his way or something, of the country splitting apart? All right, let's see.
I am not touching that. Abraham Lincoln grew up with his relatively poor family in Kentucky, eventually moving to Indiana, and finally, Illinois. He read a lot of books, worked a lot of jobs, wrote some questions.
Wait.
And finally, Illinois. He read a lot of books, worked a lot of...
So it said hunting vampires. Wait, what's going on back in... There's so much going on. Oh, Kentucky. Kentucky Fried Chicken. Alright, rail splitter. Nicolas Cage impersonator. Awesome.
Jobs, wrote some questionable poetry, and...
Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen I wrote the same. I write in both haste and speed, and left it here for fools to read. Actual poem. Give that man the Pulitzer.
Finally, entered the law profession. Despite being self-taught, he turned out to be a pretty clever and astute lawyer. In one case, a guy claimed he witnessed a murder at night, and Lincoln was like, "How could you have seen anything in the dark? There was a bright full moon." A what? A bright full moon. Can you say that again, please? There was a bright full moon. A dim half moon? No, a bright full moon. That's funny, because according to this almanac, there was a dim half moon that night.
Ooh, pulling into science. Are we also all just gonna not recognize that behind the judge is Batman? Man, brilliant tactic there.
Which makes you a liar. Well, I got a bright full moon for y'all right here. Now that's what I call a rebuttal. Lincoln and his cheekbones weren't only interested in law, however. He also...
Funny story. Abraham Lincoln...
Lincoln had...
was said... I'm not saying it, but was said... to not be a very handsome person. And that reminds me of a famous quote by him. And it was, I forgot who it was, if it was like Stephen A. Douglas, or I actually don't think it was even him. I was just thinking people that he's debated before. But somebody accused him of being two-faced. And he said, if I was really two-faced, Do you think this is the one I would wear? Basically doubling down on this idea that he's making fun of himself not being attractive or something. But
And
anyway.
his cheekbones weren't only interested in law, however. He also dabbled in the world of politics, serving as a legislator in both local and national assemblies. And what a time it was. Not even 100 years after the Founding Fathers wrote all men are created equal, politicians were already asking, yeah, but what does that mean? Exactly. It means all men. Yeah, but what does that mean? Exactly. And not just that. States' rights versus the federal government. What are the executive powers of the president? Is cereal a soup? The founding
Are muffins a cake? Is a hot dog a sandwich?
fathers left some of these questions perhaps a little too open to interpretation. And the biggest
True.
question of them all was slavery, an ugly mark on what should have been a revolutionary new nation based on liberty and democracy.
Now I mean, that's coming out of the Declaration. Yeah, I mean, they're talking about the Declaration of Independence. The slave question was not really addressed that much. I mean, in the original Constitution. Now, by the way, I'm talking about the Constitution. The American Constitution tried to make a sort of compromise in a way that slavery would be able to continue for a couple more decades, but then the slave trade would end, but slavery could continue, right? And but I mean, by the time that had happened in the mid 1800s, there were so many slaves too. So, I mean, that's going to be a different thing. Obviously, you're going to get to the fact, and you also get like the 3/5 compromise, which was a big deal. Is kind of what ends up coming out, which was one of the big debates was the southern states when they talk about representation for voting, right, in Congress, or not necessarily for voting, for how many representatives you get in Congress. Because the idea was in the House of Representatives, of course, your state, the amount of congressmen that they get is dependent on population. And one of the big things that was being kind of proposed, especially by the South, was that, or I guess by both sides, but the idea of should slaves count as somebody that is represented, right? It counts as somebody for how many people you would get congressmen for. The southern states would obviously like that because it'd mean they would get more delegates, right? Northern states said no because they don't have voting rights anyways, or that sort of thing. So you get the 3/5 compromise, which is a slave represents 3/5 of a person when it comes to representation. So that's a little bit about the background that the Constitution had done when it was addressing slavery.
Thomas Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of losing Southern states' support, it was removed. Hey guys, do you think leaving this a little vague will create any unforeseen problems in the future?
Well, ironic, Thomas Jefferson, in his whole life, had owned about 200 slaves, which is an enormous number. Because not most people don't own slaves in America by far, and those that do don't own very many because slaves are expensive. But 200 is a huge amount for anybody. One of the highest, I would assume.
Cannonball! And those unforeseen problems were now beginning to rear their ugly heads. As the nation developed, the North and the South developed along two very different lines, and two very different cultural identities emerged. Northern cities began rapidly industrializing, while the southern climate allowed for large plantations of labor-intensive crops. As a result, one half of the country didn't rely on slaves, while the other half had become economically dependent on them.
Right.
In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode, while in the North, a growing abolitionist movement was taking root. A general mistrust.
To go back to Eli Whitney, the cotton gin, from what I've understood is that slavery was actually somewhat on the decline in the South before the cotton gin. It wasn't seen as productive, and once the cotton gin came in, which really exploded the use of cotton as a manufacturing, because what I believe the cotton gin does is separate seeds, I believe, from the cotton itself, making cotton far more of a profitable type of product, which increased the use of slavery. So yeah, I've heard that the cotton gin, it definitely increased the value of slaves.
Began to develop between the North and the South, as Northerners felt the South were hell-bent on expanding slavery, and fear spread throughout the South that the North wanted to take their slaves away. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. A perfect balance.
Sure.
A happy medium. A harmonious relationship. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Missouri, and I would like to become the 23rd state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a free state.
It seems like this was inevitable after the Louisiana Purchase, really, when it came to that, which under Jefferson they bought pretty much the middle third of the continental United States there from the French and Napoleon, and are going to organize the territory, which eventually leads to exploring it, a lot of it first with like Lewis and Clark and that kind of thing. But that eventually, these are going to want to be organized into states and things like that, and which I think you could have predicted right from the onset of the Louisiana Purchase before this, that it's going to be an issue if it's going to be a debatable topic about slavery, that you add these new states, and if there's a balance, and this could upset the balance, I mean, it's going to be bad. So expansionism, and that brings an interesting thing you could think about, which is, say the Louisiana Purchase never actually happened, and there was a balance there continued to stay a balance of states or whatever, with free states and slave states. Would the Civil War have happened? Would it have happened when it did, if again that balance was there? Because that's going to start a domino effect. Interesting alternative history to think about.
Oh, no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. Missouri's going to be a slave state. Okay, listen. Why don't we just ask Missouri what it wants to be, and we slave state.
So that was the thing. They call that popular sovereignty, right, or whatever. So let the state decide. But of course, people only like that if the thing that they want to be voted on gets voted on.
Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the newest, freshest state on the scene. Maine. Hey, you can't do that, and you can't have any more slave states above this line. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later...
Except, look at all these other things that need to happen up here. Look at all this other territory. Plus, they don't know yet, because it hasn't happened yet, but there's going to be war with Mexico that is going to include Texas. So all they're doing, right, is delaying the inevitable. Which, I mean, is understandable for what they do. You want to try to avoid the conflict, and as long as you have an even balance, then, why fight about it, right? But that's all that's happening, is delaying the inevitable. The slave question is going to have to be addressed, especially by the 1800s, where slavery was being abolished all over the place. I mean, the British had abolished slavery way early. A lot of the European states had, and America was still holding on to it. As you saw in the southern states, it was a huge part of not just the southern economy, but of course the American economy in general.
It came up again. You see, as America expanded westward, each new state or territory that was added threatened to upend the delicate balance between the slave and free states. If one faction managed to outnumber the other, it could gain an easy majority and force its own ideals on the opposing side, leaving a huge portion of the population feeling spiteful and oppressed.
So it's all hypothetical. They're just assuming that if there's a upset in balance, that will somehow disrupt the political scene, which, I mean, you don't know for sure if that would happen, but you can see how fearful they were of that. They really thought that would make a difference if there was an imbalance in slave states, just, I guess, on voting in Congress and things like that.
For a while, compromises kicked the can down the road and kept the volatile balance in check, as new free and slave states were roughly added in pairs. But then one loudmouth state just had to barge in and ruin everything as usual.
Not the Texans. They're not loud.
The addition of Texas saw the United States enter into a war with Mexico, which they won, gaining a huge amount of land out west and creating even more problems. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm California, and I would like to become the 31st state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation.
Remember when California has become very relevant by 1850 because of the gold rush. It's going to start there in 48, 49, into 50. So California also became very relevant very early on when it was acquired after the Mexican-American War. So they had to figure out a way to organize it quickly because it was, again, going to be so important right from the get-go.
We'll be happy to accept you as a southern slave state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. California's gonna be a free state. Okay, listen. Why don't we just ask California what it wants to be, and we can free state?
Sovereignty?
Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the territories of New Mexico and Utah, able to freely vote for slavery themselves. Hey, you can't do that! And we can enter Northern Territory anytime we want to recapture escaped slaves. What? The issue of slavery is solved.
Yeah, Fugitive Slave Act. Idea that if a slave leaves, somehow, escapes, whatever, leaves a slave state and goes to a free state, that slave is not technically free just by entering a free state, that slave has to legally be returned to its to their origin there.
Then it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. In 1854, a Democratic senator from Illinois wanted to build a really cool choo-choo train here and proposed that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska be
changing everything
open to slavery, even though they were clearly above the Missouri Compromise line. Obviously, the northern states were like, hell no. But the southern Democrats who controlled Congress at the time were like, well, if you love liberty and democracy so much, then you should let them vote on whether slavery should be legal or not.
See, this makes makes you sound bad if you're like, it should be chosen for them. Like, what, you don't believe in democracy? This is America. But then you're always fearful that what if they vote the way you don't want to? So, put you in a precarious position there.
So it was. Huge numbers of pro and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas to sway the vote.
Little mini war,
and while they were all there, they began to beat the crap out of each other.
Yeah.
One of those settlers was a man named John Brown, a former businessman who failed at just about everything he tried.
Abolitionist.
And was arguably insane. He was a radical abolitionist and dedicated much of his life to the Underground Railroad and freeing slaves. One night, in revenge for an earlier raid by pro-slavery forces, he and his sons killed a number of pro-slavery settlers in the territory, helping to kickstart years of violence known as Bleeding Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska both eventually voted in favor of outlawing slavery. But from here, the tension began to grow at a rapid pace. In 1852,
John Brown's an interesting character. Definitely check him out in the history of the abolitionist movement. A dude that was like violently anti-slavery, and you saw with the Bleeding Kansas incident of how seriously, this debate was for people and how far they were willing to take it.
Author Harriet Beecher Stowe penned Uncle Tom's Cabin, a best-selling novel that exposed the terrible cruelty of slavery to the world. Oh, how awful. How morally corrupt a nation must be to allow such things to happen. Your Majesty, what should we do about all the starving children working in the coal mines? Nothing! In 1850...
The irony of it. Uncle Tom's Cabin, yeah, it became a bestseller. Now, most people globally, okay, even in the slave years, were not very exposed to what slave life was like. Even though slavery had been going on for centuries, did not really know what the horrors of slavery were. And books like this, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, they exposed a lot of people for the first time to what that was like, and made the abolition movement grow a lot faster than it already had been. So you can see, how literature, is going to have a big impact on history, which it does, really, for changing minds, right?
1954, the Republican Party was formed, and Abraham Lincoln emerged as a leading figure. Southern Democrats viewed the new Republican Party with mistrust, believing it to be radical and abolitionist. In 1856, a politician named Charles Sumner gave a speech in Congress, calling out slave-owning Democrats with fiery language. If slavery was a woman, she'd be an ugly one, and the senator from South Carolina would like to boink her. Representative Brooks, do you have a rebuttal? Oh, I have a rebuttal, all right. Yeah, here's a rebuttal for you.
Oh.
Oh, come on. Surely this isn't allowed. I don't know. I'll have to consult the rule book.
How about a duel?
I can't find anything about caning a political opponent, but it says here I'm not allowed to wear women's underwear. Uh-oh. News of the violence on the Senate floor took the nation by storm. Southern slave owners sent Representative Brooks new canes to replace his now broken one. And on the floors of Congress, politicians carried weapons in self-defense, which is never a good sign. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that all people of African descent, slave or free, could not be citizens, and therefore could not sue for their own freedom under any circumstances, undoing years of progress with the strike of a gavel.
Yeah, that's a huge blow right there, the Dred Scott decision. I mean, that's going to set things back quite a bit.
Now, within all this bitter debate over slavery,
Decades.
there were many nuances. North versus South, Republican versus Democrat. States versus the federal government. But let's strip all of that away. For 4 million individuals living in America, this wasn't about political intrigue or party alignment. It was about the basic human right to be free. Men, women, and children were stolen from their homelands and brought to the American continent, where for generations they were considered to be property, forced to live in poverty, and work from sunrise to sunset. Plantation overseers did whatever they felt was necessary to get the most out of their slaves. Punishments were often barbaric. Families were regularly separated, and parents could often only watch, as their children were auctioned off, never to be seen again.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, especially in the modern sense, how dehumanized the slavery issue had become, right? When you look at the deep down actual things that are happening here of people being brought to a new continent, being, sold, and bought from Africa and then brought over to the Americas, and families again potentially being ripped apart, and just the conditions themselves, and we forget actually how not long ago really this was, and we're talking 150 years, or it's not a long time ago where this was a social norm in America.
Thousands of slaves took the treacherous risk of running away, and abolitionists in the North helped many escape via the Underground Railroad as bounty hunters entered the North to chase them down. Leading figures within the abolitionist movement included many significant free black men and women.
Frederick Douglass, yeah, he was very influential because he was a former slave, but then becomes highly educated and wrote about it and exposed a lot of people to those ideas. And then Harry Tubman is a facilitator of the Underground Railroad. I don't know if you'd heard, but there was a talk and had been talk about putting Harry Tubman on money, actually replacing Andrew Jackson, which, as time has gone on, people have turned a little bit against some of those figures like Andrew Jackson, and that's kind of another story. And they're replacing with these other more civil rights figures into putting on American currency.
But it's important to note that for many of the anti-slavery white individuals in the North, opposition to slavery was often an economic issue, not a moral one, as many worried large plantations would take their lands and livelihoods away. Abraham Lincoln knew that slavery was a moral evil, and he regularly spoke out against it in powerful speeches that helped him rise through the ranks of the new Republican Party. He lamented at the hypocrisy of a great American nation meant to stand as a shining beacon of freedom, while also enslaving 4 million men, women, and children.
I do wonder if they're going to bring in some of the other stuff that people criticize about him, how, maybe saying slavery should be ended, but not necessarily that whites and blacks are equal, because he had in some speeches talked about that. He wasn't advocating for necessarily the equality of it, but the immorality maybe of slavery, but not necessarily like the equality of races.
He most famously declared in 1858 that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that one day slavery in America would end. However, even Lincoln was cautious in his opposition. He didn't want to outlaw it entirely, but simply prevent its expansion, so that given enough time, he believed it would naturally die out. Thankfully, history would force his hand. In October 1859...
There's no way he'd get support, probably from enough people, if he just wanted to ban it outright, right? And I'll let them obviously get to when he gets elected and stuff like that, but more about him protecting, I guess, the idea of, okay, slavery can exist where it does, but it's not going to be allowed to spread. Like having that compromise for whatever it was, and trying to be more strategic of a politician to make sure he at least can get some support, right? Not being too seemingly radical to be able to get into office and those sort of things, that actually get support from people on middle ground areas.
One abolitionist decided he'd try to single-handedly take down slavery by force. Who would be crazy enough to even attempt such a thing? It's our good friend, John Brown.
Yeah, there he
is.
is.
Arms from an armory in the town of Harper's Ferry, free the slaves there, and continue south, inciting a major slave uprising along the way.
Violent.
Noble cause, a bad plan, and terrible execution. Brown's men took the armory and some hostages, but were quickly surrounded by one Robert E. Lee and his U.S. Marines. Brown was captured, and a couple of months later, he was executed for treason. Northerners sympathized with Brown, but Southerners were like, you see this? They're coming for us. Soon, there'll be 1 million John Browns.
Good point. Good point to make there. Obviously, John Brown does not represent most people in the North. I mean, the dude was violently radical when it comes to anti-slavery, but you could see how the South could definitely use this as a political motivation about, yeah, what the future could be. No doubt. I mean, so it's somewhat justifiable there for what they're going to say, but not logical though.
Million John Browns? What on earth are you thinking about? The John Brown farm? Yeah, me too. To make matters worse, new northern free states meant now the southern states really were outnumbered, and they were beginning to feel bitterly spiteful and oppressed. Further fear began to spread in the South when news broke that a relatively unknown figure had just secured the Republican Party nomination for president. Abraham Lincoln, mostly well-liked among anti-slavery Northerners, had made some of the most powerfully worded speeches against slavery of any politician at the time. And now, there was a chance that he and his cheekbones could become president. For the South, that would be too much.
Remember, the Republican Party is actually very new at this time. Spoiler alert, Lincoln's going to get elected. He'll be the first Republican president.
In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. But much to their horror, when
that is obviously an issue. The dude that is a huge candidate, not even put on the ballot. You can already tell from this that this election is going to be nuts. Plus, you had 4 legitimate candidates there, like you hear Breckinridge, Douglas and John Bell, like Stephen A. This is also, by the way, a huge moment for the changing of the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party had members from all over the country, some that were had very, very differing opinions on the slave question, some supportive of it, some against it. This is the issue that really separated. That's why you see over here like Southern Democrat and Northern Democrat, where, it became very divided. And that's when a lot of people are going to leave parties, and not some, probably if you were more on the anti-slavery or more neutral on slavery, might even join the Republican Party. And then ones that aren't, stick with kind of the Southern Democratic Party. So this election was huge for changing the landscape of American political parties, with really kind of creating in a way the Republican Party and sending and more defining the Democratic Party at that time.
Results came in, Lincoln had won by an electoral college landslide.
Now this is a big deal because let's say you let's say it was 2 candidates, right? Like today in America, it's 2 legitimate candidates every year, right? But let's say the other 3, Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell, if those people had unified into maybe one candidate, not to say that it would be exactly like this, but you wonder if more people would have possibly drawn their vote away from Lincoln. At the very least, what you might have is the Bell, Breckinridge, Douglas people voting together, so you could add up those votes in a way, but possibly taken away from Lincoln, which brings in the question if the Democratic Party and the other parties weren't so divided, could they have defeated Lincoln that way? And that's not necessarily the case, because again, if you just add this up, you can add 72, 12, and 39, you're not going to get there. But would people have possibly taken from their Lincoln vote for another candidate? Yeah, probably not, but it's something to think about.
Lincoln himself tried to calm their fear. How many times do I have to tell you, I'm not going to take away your slaves? Yeah, yep. Right, Honest Abe. We've had enough of you Northerners. We're going to go form our own country. You can't do that. Why not? Well, if you had won the election, would it be okay for us to leave? Of course not. Well, why not? Because that's not how victim mentality works. Many states felt...
I hadn't heard sources about that necessarily of... Did Lincoln actually approach them and give them that impression that, like, okay, you wouldn't like it if we left or something like that, if the election had gone the other way, right? I hadn't heard that kind of rebuttal, but I guess that would be an interesting one. But it's interesting that, again, with Lincoln repeatedly saying, I'm not going to end slavery, it's just not going to expand any further. You don't have to worry if you're a southern state. That's simply the fact of him getting elected, which they're obviously going to talk about, because states started seceding from the Union immediately after his election, even before he was inaugurated. and actually officially in office states had left, simply on the fact that they just did not trust him even before he swore his oath into office.
Felt that when they joined the Union, they always withheld the right to leave it whenever they pleased. Many people living in 19th century America often felt more loyalty to their state than to the nation. And now, with the South feeling like it had lost its voice in the federal government, they were out of here. South Carolina was the first to go, and over a period of 6 months, one by one, 11 slave states officially seceded from the Union, with just 4 contested border states opting to remain. The seceding states issued a number of official documents justifying their secession. South Carolina proclaimed that it was northern states' hostility to slavery that rendered the federal government illegitimate.
Okay, hold on. I want to read this. An increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government has ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. So, I mean, they're outright saying this is about slavery, and I know the common thing is about states' rights and stuff like that, but I guess it's states' rights to determine their own slave holding rights.
Mississippi declared that their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, and in a speech, the Confederate vice president stated that the new Confederate government rested upon what he called the great truth of racial inequality. Revered American generals, such as Robert E. Lee, opted to side with their states over the Union. And with all the chaos, one New York lawyer wrote that rather than a bald eagle, America's national bird should be a debilitated chicken. And hey, I kind of like that.
I heard that originally they were thinking of doing a North American turkey, which would have been interesting, especially for Thanksgiving. If Thanksgiving we slaughter our national bird.
One man, watching the crisis unfold, knew it would be his job to solve it. Lincoln was just about to hop on a train and become the President of the United States of America. Hey man, you're hella ugly. Grow a beard or something to hide that face. Good idea.
Grace Bedell.
Still ugly. With assassination plots already underway, Lincoln had to travel to Washington, D.C. under heavy disguise and protection. All along the way, he received stacks of threatening letters. May the hand of the devil strike you down. You are destroying this country. Damn you, every breath you take. Love from... Grandma? At his inauguration speech, Lincoln once again reiterated that no, I do not want to take away anyone's slaves. But for Lincoln, he did want to preserve the Union. He declared secession to be nothing but an illegitimate rebellion. In your hands, and not in mine, he said, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. It was clear Lincoln was ready.
So you can see his big concern. It makes you wonder if, a lot of alternate realities here. What if the South was just allowed to leave and you'd have a different country, like, legitimately happen? What would that country look like? What would the two countries be? The Confederate States of America and then I guess the United States of America. What would that actually look like? Interesting, huh?
And willing to get freaky and open up a can of Scatman John if he had to. Whether he had the support of the people, however, was in question. In the end, it was the Confederates that fired the first shot.
Right.
As they seceded, the Confederate states began...
It's a complicated story at Fort Sumter here, which is assuming what they're going to get to.
Seizing federal U.S. property throughout the South. Off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, was one such federal property, Fort Sumter, held by a measly, undersupplied U.S. force. The Confederate militia...
Yeah, so the debate was, okay, the southern states have seceded. So, like, military holdings, government holdings, should those justifiably be remain in the United States control, right? Even though they're in southern states that have defected and are supposed to be part of an autonomous country that way, right? Because they're declaring it, but the other side obviously is not relinquishing that power. So obviously that's going to be an issue.
There demanded the fort surrender, a request which was quickly denied, and any remaining hope for a peaceful solution to the secession crisis probably then died when the Confederates did this. The Battle of Fort Sumter is considered to be the beginning of the American Civil War.
Right.
Many of the Confederates there,
at least from the fighting perspective, yeah,
also considered it to be the end of the American Civil War. They hoped Old Abe would just sigh and say, "Okay, you win." Unfortunately for them, Lincoln actually said, "You're about to get a roundhouse to the face." Lincoln sent out the call for 75,000 volunteers.
Call the
Signed
Gondor!
up in droves, hopeful for some adventure and good old-fashioned F-U-N. In the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cheekbones had also sent out the call for
It's the era of cheekbones, all right.
100,000 men. As ever, both sides hoped for a quick end to the war. Is it over yet? No, Jimmy. It's been 1 week. Is it over now? No. How about now? If you ask that one more time, I swear I will turn this army around and you'll all have to go back home to your wives and children. But in particular, the South knew the conflict would pose a bit of a challenge. How can we expect to win with a population of only 5 million against 22 million in the North? If you count us 4 million slaves, you'd have 9 million.
Doesn't matter.
Great idea. Hand these rifles out to all the men. Wait a minute. You almost had me there. The problem for Lincoln
Exactly.
was that many of his top generals were getting old and were being a bit too cautious. The commanding general was a man named Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and by now, he was too fat to even mount a horse. Okay, chaps, we need to come up with a plan. Hit me. We could wait for the Confederates to come and apologize.
Nope.
Maybe we should all sit in a circle and discuss our feelings.
Okay.
Crossing the Delaware into New Jersey worked for me. Those are all terrible ideas.
George, you're
and
dead.
You. Wrong video. I'm the greatest president in the history of this nation. Yeah, we'll see about that, dingus. Eventually, Lincoln's generals came up with a multi-pronged strategy. First, a blockade would cut off and starve
Onto
the South
Richmond.
of supplies by sea. Secondly, taking control of the great Mississippi River would sever the South's economic artery while splitting it in two. And finally,
Okay.
the main Union force in the East would move south and take the Confederate capital, ending the war.
Onto Richmond became like this motto. You take the capital and it goes. But I mean, it seems like a pretty sound strategy. The Mississippi River obviously it's the heart of the American economy, as it moves all the resources. And but yeah, then blockade, because the South definitely requires exports, right? They export a lot of products around the world. So blockade that. I mean, it's a pretty sound economic and I guess military plan. But on paper, I mean, yeah, but what's the strategy? I mean, that's the goal, and I guess part of the strategy, but the execution, that's going to be a lot harder, right?
Bada boom, bada bing. Skirmishes began to break out across the nation, and the Union Army in the East began to move south towards Richmond. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached Manassas, where they came upon a large Confederate force. It's almost like they were waiting for us. How did they know? As it turned out, spies in DC had sent a coded message to the Confederates warning of the invasion. Did you use NordVPN? What the heck is NordVPN?
Segue.
I'm so glad you asked. Do you use the internet? Me too. Do you like internet safety? Me too. Hey, we should hang out sometime so I can tell you about NordVPN. NordVPN has over 5,000 secure and super fast servers in 60 countries that allow you to surf the net safely without personal data logging. Not only does it help you stay secure, but with just a click of a button, you can take a quick trip to Sweden and enjoy some Nordic crime dramas. Is there some amazing content on YouTube that's
Planted your
still
final
blocked in
potato.
your country? Not to fear. NordVPN is here. NordVPN gives you access to all of these amazing features, and it has a 30-day money-back guarantee. So click the link in the description
works
below,
in China.
nordvpn.com/oversimplified, and use promo code oversimplified to get 70% off an annual subscription. That's only $3.49 a month, plus an additional month for free. Again, that's nordvpn.com/oversimplified. And as always, you'll be supporting my channel. So thank you. Now where were we? Oh yeah, Secession, Fat Man, and the Union invasion into Virginia. The two sides encountered each other at Manassas, and both geared up for the first major battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates rapidly brought in support via rail, and the two sides were about equal in numbers. However, they were also equally inexperienced. A large number of civilians also rode out by carriage from DC to picnic on the nearby hills and watch the excitement unfold.
I heard about that. It's like these people have no clue what war is like. It's like they're so removed from it, right? The soldiers, again, haven't experienced anything like... I mean, I guess, yeah, if you fought in the Mexican-American War, you know, for some of them, but like, the civilians are out picnicking. I'd heard about this before, and early on, they're just like, this probably won't be a big deal, right? Or, you know, whatever. And then I'm sure once the battle breaks out, it becomes horrifying and, okay, not what we thought was going on. Michael Bay, eat your heart out. Okay.
Nobody seemed to quite understand how destructive this war was going to be. The Union forces pulled a flanking maneuver to hit the Confederates on their left, and the two sides fired on each other in rows. Farm families living in the area were forced to flee the fighting, including a man named Wilmer McLean. Hurry up, Martha! There's a war out here! The more you tell me to hurry up, the slower I will go! The Union force saw initial success, pushing the Confederates back to Henry Hill. But one as of yet fairly unknown General Thomas Jackson had arrived, and he took a defensive position, standing firm like a stone wall, holding the Union Army off,
go,
and
right?
finally
Stonewall.
sending them running back to Washington, D.C., with heavy casualties.
Let's look. So first major battle. All right, more on the American side, killed, but more wounded. 1,200 missing. Is that, I guess, would that mean more just like defected, I guess?
The sobering reality of war hit both sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major battle, had to face the serious prospect that they may not actually win this war. President Lincoln, General Jackson whipped us so hard, the Confederates are calling him Stonewall Jackson. Wait, that's why they're calling him that? Not because he looks like he ran face first into a stone wall? Apparently not. Worse yet, the North had also lost the first...
So that was a humbling experience, yeah, for the North, because they're like, oh, we can out-manufacture them, we got all this and that, but like, yeah, not the case. You have to rethink it. I'm not just going to roll this over.
Major battle
right?
out west, giving away control of southwest Missouri. All of this was terrible news for Abraham Lincoln, especially since many of his generals and cabinet already didn't have much respect for him. They felt he was incapable of running a war because he seemed a bit like your friendly old grandpa. He famously loved a long-winded story and a good pun. I've been so busy, my wife is missing me, but her aim is starting to improve. But deep down, few realized he could also be incredibly shrewd.
Dad joke.
Oh, Abe, you're so funny. Funny how? Funny like I'm a clown? Abe, I was just... No, funny how? Like I'm here to amuse you? During the war, Lincoln committed acts that were viewed by some as impeachable. His administration suppressed the free media from printing articles sympathetic towards the South. Some Southern sympathizers were even arrested without a trial. Lincoln's criticizers...
Yeah, suspension of habeas corpus. They talk about that being heavily unconstitutional. You know, what's going to end up happening here is definitely a precedent will be set that during wartime, executive powers are increased, right? You're going to see it in other wars. And President Lincoln he set a precedent that with suspending a lot of these rights, again, like due process and fair trial and, yeah, suppressing speech and stuff, that like during wartime it can be justified for the national security of the nation, and that precedent will be followed. People say that a lot about American history is during major wars you will see something like this happen in most all major wars.
Accusing him of being a tyrant. But to quote the man himself, hey, it's war, baby. What are you gonna do? By the end of 1861, with things already looking bad for the North, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass couldn't believe that the Union Army weren't enlisting black men. He continued to put pressure on Lincoln to make the war about emancipation.
True. I mean, maybe they just thought they wouldn't work well alongside the white soldiers, or white soldiers wouldn't want to do it. That sort of thing. Well, just to add, not necessarily related to this point, but for wondering at this time, you know, like at what point would Lincoln try to push for freeing the slaves, right? Is actually kind of cautious of that, because when you go back to like the battle lines, there were states, the border states specifically, good 3 or so of them, that were slave states but had not seceded from the Union, right? That were still technically part of the Union. And one of the things that Lincoln was afraid of was that if he did that, right, that it would kind of do, I guess, a couple things. One, it would upset those states, right? He doesn't want to lose the states that, even if they do have slavery, wouldn't want to lose them from the Union, of course. But also it would have declared in a way that this war was indeed maybe about slavery, which is something you were trying to back off, to try to play the kind of card that, no, this is about protecting the Union. It's not necessarily about slaves, right? So even though everybody, I mean, knows that's what it's going to be, it's about, but yeah, like don't say it's about that though, okay? Because that could commit fence sitters to, one side or the other, and especially you don't want them on the other side of your fence, right?
Mr. President, it's time to make the war about emancipation.
Here we go.
I don't want to ruffle any feathers. The feathers
So they're
are
getting to
already
that.
ruffled. But Lincoln, hanging on to hope for a quick end to the conflict, continued to fight only for the preservation of the Union. It was decided, however, that escaped slaves from the Confederacy could be held as enemy contraband, and many of these men were put to work bolstering the Union's infrastructure and supply lines. Hoping to get things moving, Lincoln made young General George McClellan the new commanding general, and McClellan began to train up his men. He thought a lot of himself, however, and believed he was going to be the nation's great savior. And like many others, he didn't approve of the president's handling of the war. On one occasion, Lincoln went to McClellan's house to meet with him, but McClellan was late returning home. He kept the president waiting, and when he finally got there, he just straight up went to bed. Now that's what I call disrespectful. McClellan talked the talk. But
Wow. Nice. Lincoln goes through a bunch of generals. He was one that was like, you do what I say, right? And directly, or I'm going to remove you. And he goes through a bunch of people. He really does.
You walk the walk? No. Like Lincoln's other generals, McClellan was maddeningly cautious. Hey man, could you move south and attack the enemy? What? Are you crazy? What if they have a big scary army down there? They probably do. What? Oh my gosh! McClellan worried that he did not have the numbers he needed to fight effectively. What if they have like 10,000 men? Okay, no problem. We'll get you 20,000 men. Well, what if they have 30,000 men? I'll need 40. Okay, you can have 40. Well, what if they have 50? I'll need 60. Lincoln tried, but it was all in vain. McClellan would not make a move for the rest of the year. The North's one saving grace for now was a general out west fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee, General Ulysses S. Grant. Cool, collected, methodical, and a big fan of whiskey. His chief of staff took it upon himself to keep Grant sober. One officer said that Grant habitually wore an expression as though he were determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And that determination led him to score a number of key victories when others around him were failing. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant was like, "Why does Stonewall Jackson get a cool nickname and I don't? I want a cool nickname." "Sir, the Confederates say they're ready to surrender and want to know your terms." "No terms, just unconditional surrender." Hey, unconditional surrender, Grant.
Is that true?
That's a pretty cool nickname, right? Guys? Right? Later in April 1862, the Confederates launched a sudden attack on Grant's army at Shiloh, but the determined, unconditional surrender Grant threw his lines at the rebels.
So he's saying here, I guess, that the war could have been over under certain conditions at this time. Interesting to think about once again, right?
And sent them running. The battle resulted in the heaviest casualties in U.S. history so far. And
Let's look at those.
them running. The battle resulted in the heaviest casualties.
All right. Once again, you're seeing more killed when it comes to the northern side there. Now that's gonna be a big deal or interesting again because the Northern Army is larger, but you can see how well the Confederate Army fights with that when you're seeing these different casualty rates there. Jeez.
In U.S. history so far, and despite his victory, Grant found himself under fire. You have to get rid of Grant. Why? Didn't he win? Yes, but he just threw his men at the enemy. Isn't that the point? Also, he's a loony drunk. Well, what does he like to drink? I believe whiskey, sir. Then send him more. Lincoln watched as his cabinet did nothing but bicker, and his generals did nothing. But then, worst of all, personal tragedy struck. Lincoln's young son, Willie, very much loved by the president, died of typhoid fever at the age of 11. Lincoln was a sensitive man and was heavily affected by the loss. His wife was inconsolable.
Wow, so you wonder if that's going to change his tune on stuff, like get him refocused on different things in life or change his view on life and stuff like that. That can happen. I mean, it's happened in history before, right? Reminds me, it's a very different story, but of how loss of someone can change someone's future decisions, like the Mongol Empire, right? The Mongol Empire was trying to attack deep into Europe, and remember the Khan's family dies, and the Khan goes back to kind of Mongolia or from Europe, and comes back, or after, I guess, as a result of the funeral or whatever, lost a lot of, it seemed like his motivation to continue to conquer into Europe, which is going to change European history if the Mongols had continued to conquer, but kind of lost the motivation to push even deeper into Europe.
But one of Lincoln's greatest traits, what made him such a great leader, was in the darkest of times, with composure and determination. He kept moving forward. He knew it was his responsibility to hold himself and his family together, and by doing so, he hoped to hold the nation together. And he had it with McClellan's inaction. Lincoln decided he was gonna take control. In March 1862, Lincoln firmly ordered McClellan to once again move south towards Richmond. McClellan insisted instead they move by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and attack Richmond from the southeast. Yes, said Lincoln. Okay, anything. Lincoln held on to some of McClellan's men to defend D.C. from a nearby Stonewall Jackson wreaking havoc in the Shenandoah Valley, and he sent McClellan south. McClellan landed on the peninsula, and he began to move inland. He came up against a small Confederate army that had dug in at Yorktown. McClellan vastly outnumbered them.
Hey, also where the American Revolution ended. This doesn't seem like a good strategy. I mean, look at the geography here. You're funneling into a defended area. This just doesn't look very good, does it?
Force. But it's said that Confederate General Magruder deceived McClellan by cleverly maneuvering his smaller force and making McClellan believe he faced a huge army. No, you have way more men than them. Move forward. No. McClellan settled in for a month-long siege, giving time for Johnston to move south from Manassas and Magruder time to retreat. When he finally entered the city and found it deserted, he declared it a victory, calling his success brilliant. Then, after meeting some resistance at Williamsburg, McClellan moved to within just 20 miles of Richmond.
All right.
His army's able to hear the church bells ringing in the enemy capital. You still outnumber them. Go give him hell. No. McClellan once again held back, moving slowly and defensively, and with his army split in two, the Confederates saw an opportunity to strike back. McClellan's advance was halted, and now the Confederates pulled an ace out of their sleeve. General Lee, you're up. Do you think we should evacuate Richmond? No, Mr. President, no need. General Robert E. Lee, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the time, was now in charge. One of his biggest strengths.
I mean, yeah, his legacy goes back to as a student. Military academy of like ranking extremely high as a young officer and passing tests like very high in his like graduating class. I'd seen there's statistics that show that.
Strength was his ability to read the mind of his enemy, and he knew McClellan was cautious and weak. After moving Stonewall Jackson south to join him, and even though he had a smaller army, Lee hit McClellan in a series of fast-paced, close combat battles that had McClellan spooked. McClellan retreated the Union Army back again and again and again, escaping the peninsula and returning to D.C. Lee had defeated McClellan, and the campaign had failed. Well, that was a major success.
Goodbye, McClellan.
A success? Tell me exactly what was successful about that. Well, we successfully retreated. You lost. I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. Things just kept looking worse for the North. At least their navy had seen some success, capturing a number of key port cities, notably when they steamrolled past Confederate forts to take New Orleans.
New Orleans is the most important city, really, of the American West, I guess at this time, Midwest, because that's where all the economic activity out of the Mississippi comes through. So you get the industrial areas and things coming across a railroad all the way up from places like Chicago, and then coming through the Midwest. You know, like Chicago's like a hub, you know, for trains from east and west. That's going to hook up to, you know, hook up with some of the travel going and economic trade going on the Mississippi, and all comes out through New Orleans. That's a huge economic advantage do you have, because if you control New Orleans, I mean, you almost control the whole Western economy.
Speaking of the Navy, both sides had begun using ironclads, so that's pretty cool. But in the East, they still
dangerous though. They were
after McClellan's disastrous campaign, Lincoln briefly sent out one General John Pope to attack Northern Virginia. Hey man, just checking in. How's it going? Well, the Confederates kicked my butt at Cedar Mountain. Then they raided my camp and ran off with my money and clothes. Also, I appear to have been wedgied. Lee defeated Pope at yet another battle at Bull Run, in which...
Man, look how close they're getting to D.C.
I appear to have been wedgied. Lee
check that out.
Defeated Pope at yet another battle...
Doesn't look good for the Union, does it? I mean, they're losing. And not only that, but getting pushed back.
At Bull Run, in which nearby farm families once again got caught up in the fighting. Hurry up, Martha! There's another war out here! I'm waiting for my hair to dry. Wilmer McLean, sick of war, moved his family south, where he knew the war would definitely, absolutely, never touch him again. But Lincoln had yet
Maddox
another
Courthouse.
problem to
That's
contend
where the
with.
war
European
ends,
powers,
right?
in particular the UK, were looking increasingly like they may intervene diplomatically on the side of the Confederates. They were missing their
Yeah, they depend on a lot of products coming out of the South, for sure. So you just see that. Also, with the South being more, well, I mean, it's a long time since the American Revolution, but the South being more leaning towards the British and American Revolution, where most of the patriot activity especially happened in the North, you'd have that. So interesting, the British, if they were going to side with somebody, it probably would be the South, just for that aspect. And not because, I mean, they don't, even though Britain had abolished slavery, that was not something they even cared about. That the South, I'm sure, was continuing that, right? They were going to join the North to end slavery in America. They don't care about that.
precious supply of southern cotton because of the Union blockade, and they wanted to see a swift conclusion to the war. The tension between America and Great Britain had been increasing, especially after Confederate diplomats were discovered on a British ship. Now, after McClellan's failure to take Richmond, the UK declared it impossible for the North to win. Lincoln needed something to prevent Europe from getting involved, and after more petitioning from abolitionists, he decided maybe the time was finally right to make the war about ending the institution he hated, slavery. If the North had a noble cause to fight for, Europe would be less likely to intervene. But Lincoln and his cabinet knew before they could declare...
Hold on, trying to digest this. The war's about slavery. Then Europe would be, let's say, more or less likely to get involved.
There's something as radical, Europe would be less likely to intervene.
Okay,
but
less
Lincoln
likely.
and his cabinet...
So they don't have to touch that, like, oh, we don't want to touch that issue, okay? If that's what it's about slavery, no, thank you, right? Interesting tactic to see if that would actually work. But here's the thought. I mean, they're obviously going to get the Emancipation Proclamation. You couldn't expect if he's just like, all right, we're going to free the slaves. Because obviously the South is going to be like, first off, Lincoln, you don't have any authority down here. We are not part of the United States. You may think we are, but we're not. And second of all, just because you're going to put it on paper doesn't mean that, like, us as the slave owners are just going to look at it and go, oh, I guess the slaves are free now and they're gone and now our economy's ruined. It's like, not like that's going to happen, right?
knew before they could...
But if he does truly think that just the declaration of that, the emancipation, just from what he saw as a legal perspective, just might change the, I guess, moral view of this war, which he's hoping that will positively affect the North. So, I mean, pretty bold strategy to think this could actually make an impact on the war.
declare something as radical as emancipation, they needed a victory, especially now that the Confederates were about to go on the attack. Aware that he had a limited number of men and supplies, Lee now hoped that if he could just threaten Washington, D.C. militarily, he would gain Europe's recognition and crush Northern morale in time for the midterm elections, forcing the North to negotiate. With confidence at an all-time high, for the first time, Robert E. Lee invaded the North. But on September 13th, the North finally had some luck. Oh boy, it's my lucky day! A cigar in a field. Hey, what's this wrapped around it? Oh my god!
Oh.
That's right. The North had discovered General Lee's battle plans wrapped around some cigars, and in them, they saw that Lee had split up his forces. McClellan headed out from D.C., and the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam, a crucial battle that would decide the course of the war. It saw the most
Brutal
vicious
battle,
fighting to
yeah.
date, and still remains the single bloodiest day in American history. But, for once, the North
that.
came out victorious, and Lee was forced to retreat. He's on the run. Chase him down and finish him off. No. You know what, old buddy?
You're done.
You're fired. The
Yep.
North had won their
Yeah, I know Antietam was a big one because as far as impact of the war, you already saw McClellan was pretty standoffish at times, very, very cautious, I guess, in general. And with how bloody Antietam was, I know that definitely influenced McClellan to be even more like, hey, because if I remember right, they're gonna like win at Antietam or whatever, and Lincoln wanted wanted McClellan to pursue basically the retreating Confederates, and McClellan was, I believe, on the mind that it was like, hey, enough people have died today that's enough, right? But Lincoln is thinking of more from a strategic point of view, and that was like the final straw that you could have really could have gained some kind of advantage here and in this war, and you balked on it. So yeah, that's it. So understandable, honestly, in a way, if you think about it from both perspectives, how brutal that was, and didn't want to sacrifice any more victims, but at the same time, like, it could have been a very big thing to counter the tide of this war, which, as we've seen for the most part, up in, with this, is not really gone that well for the North.
Victory. Lincoln breathed a huge sigh of relief, and with that win, he was prepared to take a huge step. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In January, all slaves held in the Confederate States would be, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, officially free. Throughout the North, free black men and women rejoiced, knowing that if the North were to win, their brothers and sisters would no longer be held in bondage.
I mean, that would be the effect. But again, like I was saying just a couple minutes ago, it's not like you're going to issue this and then the southern plantation owners are like, oh, I guess, they're free. I guess they're just free now and it's gone. Like, no, you're going to have to still fight a war. It's like when America declares independence from Britain. It's like, okay, it's not going to do anything. You're still going to have to somehow force the other side to agree to that to become independent. You know what I mean? So you can say it, but yeah, I mean, it does set does set it up that, yeah, if the war is over, I mean, the slaves are going to be freed. So
the proclamation also had the intended effect on Europe, who were not willing to oppose a pledge to end slavery. An outraged Confederacy knew that Lincoln had given the war a new meaning. It was no longer just about the preservation of the Union.
And remember, what big reason Lincoln probably didn't do this earlier was because there were states that had not joined the Confederate, or not seceded and not joined the Confederacy, that were slave states, and that was a big fear that they would then jump to the other side. Right? Big fearful thing there.
Now it was about creating a new union, washed clean of its original sin. A union without slavery.
Wow, we're into it, huh? Yikes, half an hour. Time goes by fast, right? I mean, that's just a half an hour of this video. I've been talking, longer than that, but amazing what they're able to do with seemingly a lot of time, but packing so much into it. You can see why these guys, they only post videos every 6-7 months or something like that. I mean, it take a long time of how much he's able to put in and pack in there. But great stuff. So it's cool they did a part 2 right away, because sometimes they take a long time. Looks like they really wanted to just get those out, which would be great. So definitely look out for a part 2 reaction. I'm glad to be able to come back to American history. I don't teach American history. I did earlier in my teaching career, but I haven't for years now. And it's good to get this refresher about a lot of these events when I used to teach this, and come back, oh yeah, this and that, and that sort of thing. And even in college, I had really focused on world history topics and not specifically on American topics. It's always just kind of been I've been more interested to spread out my knowledge outside of that, but always got standard American history education. But good to get that back to more as a world historian, which I tend to focus on, but to see more of this, the history of my nation, that as well. And definitely elements of teaching American history that I do miss, but this kind of it scratches that itch just a little bit, that I can constantly come back to American history there. Well, once again, Oversimplified, awesome channel, great stuff. Hard to add, again, a lot of humor sometimes to some of these things, because it's a verge, to being, getting these funny stuff, but then it's also a very serious topic. Especially from an American perspective, is this the bloodiest war that Americans will be involved in, and a huge part of our history. Then the whole moral dilemma of slavery and trying to put that in there. So they, strike a good balance, of course, with that. So, but overall impressions, great to learn this stuff. Hopefully you're learning a lot of these things. I was able to definitely learn a little bit more of the motives, and especially with the Emancipation Proclamation, the strategic thing, especially from the foreign perspective, because I hadn't thought of that as much as I probably should have in the past, to see that effect, because that always brought an interesting debate when I did years ago teach U.S. history about why did he do this? Why emancipate the slaves, right? Just for one of the last topics there. But anyway, hopefully you're able to get somewhat of a perspective from mine, or if you're interested in my opinion, I'm assuming that's why you're in here. But Anyway, all right, awesome. So before we go, a link down below in the description will take you to this original video. Please, again, if you like this, give them a like and subscribe. Show your support there. We need to do our part as fans of history. Okay, whether you're a fan or a professional in the history field, that we are constantly supporting historical content creators. It's really important to support history education. So make sure you do that. If you like their channel, buy their stuff. They got awesome, cool stuff there, and that's awesome. If you liked what I'm doing here, especially if you're new to the channel, I'd love to have you as a subscriber and be a familiar face in our history community. Hit that sub button, enable notifications, because I do lots of live premieres and I do live streams. Another way to really interact with our community is our Discord server. We have thousands of people in our Discord server, and you can always find a conversation from like-minded history buffs, whether you're deep into it or very casual. There's kind of something for everyone there, but another way to interact with the channel that way. I want to thank everybody that has been supporting in monetarily ways too. Patreon, thank you to everyone that has joined up and pledged on Patreon. One of the benefits that you get from that is vote in polls that get videos featured on this website. So I really, really appreciate everyone that has been doing that and supporting history education. Thanks to channel members. Been a few people that have been joining newly. My channel got the ability to have channel memberships, which is kind of like subscribing to a channel like on Twitch or something like that, where since I do a lot of live streams, you get a lot of those benefits, where in chat you're going to get badges and emotes and all that stuff, and it supports the channel. The super chats, thank you so much to everyone that's been doing that. There's too many people to name, but I really appreciate that, and just mostly you being supportive of history education. It's such an important thing that we're all kind of part of here in lots of different ways. But first and foremost, just thank you for being around and learning about history. It's so important, and I feel like it's becoming a lost thing in the kind of consciousness of America and around the world, of how important history education is to understanding our world. So thank you first and foremost just for being that and being around. And with this, we'll go ahead and end here. Look out for part 2 in the near future, and we'll see you later. Bye.